Laden. You said, I am frightened of the implications of this tape. Why are you frightened?
Well, first of all, the tape is real. I mean, we've been told intelligence officials say it's real. I can promise you it is. I talked to my sources in the region, and they are impeccable sources, and it is real. I think one of the most disturbing things about it is we've got a hit list. First America, then Britain, and then quite clearly all those countries which have decided to join Mr. Bush's so-called war on terror, quote unquote, including Canada, including Italy, including Germany. What is also important is that he chose this moment to, if you like, return from the dead. I think what actually happened, and this is what worries me about it, is that bin Laden realized that with the crisis over Iraq, showdown as it's called in America, we've reached a point where there is so much anger in the Arab world that his absence, his silence, would not be supportable in the eyes of his own followers, and so he re-emerged. And I don't think for a moment he actually sits wherever he is, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, wherever, and says, you know, plan B, go into action. I think that when he speaks like this, it is, in a sense, a forewarning to all those people who may be trying to attack the allies of the United States to go ahead with whatever plans they may have, even though I don't think bin Laden will actually personally necessarily know about them. And I think that is disturbing. I was talking at a university meeting in September 10th here in the United States, and someone said to me, what do you think the next target of bin Laden would be? And I thought oil tankers, but I didn't say it because I don't think one should put anything into anyone's mind. And sure enough, next was oil tankers. And when I think of the possible targets in Europe, I shudder to conceive of what these mean. Every morning in Beirut, which is where I live, I wake up with a great feeling of foreboding for the next day.
You can't wake up this morning and look at a newspaper or turn on the television set without seeing the inspectors arriving in Iraq. First of all, can I ask you, as someone who has covered this area and watched this issue over the years, what do you think of the television, the news coverage of this? I saw in some of the cutaways last night the numbers of reporters following these inspectors around. How are they going to inspect with all of these reporters?
I'm sure they'll be able to break free of the reporters. I think what's wrong with the television coverage is not so much the reporters who are there, and after all, they're going to get the crumbs that Mr. Blix is good enough to give them. I think the problem is that it's being played out, particularly in the United States, as a kind of war serial. Showdown in Iraq, what comes next? The music is built up on almost every American TV show now, like a Hollywood movie, you know, golden subtitles at the bottom. This happened, of course, in the 1991 Gulf War. It happened in the immediate aftermath of September the 11th, 2001. More and more in the West, and particularly in the United States, we're playing these great human dramas as a kind of TV serial. And you've got to remember that even now, with the inspectors in Iraq, there are still many people dying because of the indirect effect of UN sanctions. But there are no TV cameras looking at children in southern Iraq, for example, because that's not very sexy, and there aren't any subtitles, and Showdown in Iraq doesn't fit in very well with that. But these are the issues which concern Arabs, and which make Arabs angry, and which promote the kind of people who support bin Laden. So there's a whole area there which is not being looked at and regarded, along with the kind of TV jingle response that we have towards these very dramatic events.
You've been pretty critical of American journalists. Does that extend from television into print?
Not so much, although I'd have to say that more and more now I find that American journalism seems to rely on a very incestuous relationship with government, with the US administration. I gave a talk here in New York last night in which I was joking, but seriously, about the degree, the number of newspaper stories which begin with the first paragraph and the last words are always, comma, officials say, intelligence analysts say. I was amused. I was opening the New York Times just now, and sure enough, there are all our favorite officials, anonymous, of course, back sourcing stories again. It does seem to me that very often the challenging element which we should have in journalism, like at what point in the last year did Saddam Hussein take over from bin Laden as our chief hate figure? What on earth was the connection between Saddam Hussein and September the 11th? Zero, I suspect. And it seems to me that rather than challenging the US administration on very clear issues, I mean, what was Donald Rumsfeld doing chatting to Saddam Hussein in 1983 at the height of his crimes against humanity on the Iran-Iraq war front? Instead of doing that, it seems that the newspapers are a kind of echo chamber of what the government says and wants. There's a very fine Israeli journalist, Amira Haas, whom I much admire, and we were discussing some months ago what was the purpose of journalism. And I was going on about how we were writing the first pages of history, which is true up to a point, but I was waffling a bit, and she said to me, our job is to monitor the centres of power. And I think that's one of the best definitions I've ever heard of our profession. And I try to think of it all the time when I'm working now, but I find that when I open the New York Times and the Washington Post, they are not monitoring the centres of power. They have become the functionaries, the fonctionnaires, as the French would say, the mouthpieces of the centres of power. And that, I think, is a great pity, because I think Americans deserve to be much better informed than they are.
We're going to open up our phone lines and invite you to join us. You'll see the phone numbers at the bottom of your screen, and you can start dialing now if you like. Now, let's just jump into the New York Times now that you've mentioned it, because I have something.
I hope I've read the same page as you have.
Well, it's a little bit different than what you were talking about, but I'm interested in William Broad's piece, in which he talks about the arms team coming into Iraq. And across the right-hand side of the page here, if we can show this to our viewers, they call it a primer, and they actually go down through the nuclear sites, ballistic missile facilities, chemical weapons facilities, biological weapons facilities. You get a map. The source is the CIA. And I guess my question to you is this giving away the store?
Well, it depends if you believe what the CIA says. I mean, my problem, you see, with all these stories, and I base this on my own experience in the Middle East over the past 26 years, when I've read many, many stories like this about, for example, Lebanon, not about nuclear weapons in Lebanon, but just about the country, when I've been able on the ground to go out and check things, and very often they're wrong. Or on other occasions, we've had stories put out by the CIA which are clearly intended to provoke journalists to go out and find out if they're true or not, thus doing the CIA's job for them. I've found in my experience that American intelligence and the CIA and British intelligence and Russian intelligence and Arab intelligence and Israeli intelligence have one common denominator, and that is that they lie through their teeth. And it's the job of journalists to find out whether the CIA are telling the truth, and if not, why not? If they are, well, fine, the inspectors, I'm sure, have these maps too. We know that the Americans have been furnishing vast amounts of information to Mr. Blix and his friends, and be sure that they'll try to act upon it. But I don't think they'll act totally upon it, because remember, before the UN weapons inspectors were withdrawn 4 years ago, there were allegations which proved to be true that American intelligence was using the UN inspectorate to gather information about Iraq and about the Iraqi leadership. So there's going to be some circumspection on the part of Mr. Blix and his colleagues as to how much they're going to be directed by the CIA, and whether, of course this will be their question, whether they're being directed to these various sites, not so much to find out whether those sites contain weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear, but more perhaps to find out whether they're worth bombing the next time there is to be an attack on Iraq. So I think the whole issue of a CIA source raises a number of questions, and we shouldn't be showing just the maps that the CIA would like us to see. We should be asking why they're showing us those maps.
Do you believe that there are any CIA operatives in the group of inspectors?
I don't know, but I'm still trying to find out. But I really don't know, and it would be pointless for me to suggest that I think there might be or might not be. I don't have any facts to suggest that is the case at the moment, but I'm still having a look at the biographies of those inspectors.
This is Robert Fisk's new book. It's called Pity the Nation, The Abduction of Lebanon. We'll be talking about that as we go through also this morning. Louisville, Kentucky is the first caller for Robert Fisk.
Good morning, Mr. Fisk.
Good morning.
I've been listening to C-SPAN here for the last hour or so, and the calls, one right after another, they've quoted the Bible, they've talked about religion, and it is absolutely scary. I disagree with the president. He is my commander-in-chief, and I respect that position, but his ideas and or whoever has told him this is what we need to do, I disagree with. They talk numbers of $200 billion to fight the ground war. They talk numbers of 250,000 troops on the ground. And I guess my question to you, sir, just how much does the religion play in a part of this whole frenzied attitude It is just
Okay.
beyond me.
Thanks, Louisville. Mr. Fisk.
I think down there in Kentucky, you probably have a better idea than I do, because I live in the Middle East, where I have to look at a different element of what you would say was the religious background. Look, we know that Christian fundamentalism in the United States, which I think is a very dangerous form of fundamentalism, just as I would say the same about the Islamic version, clearly is an engine, a motive power behind and let's use the word, the crusading zeal of this administration. I don't know if you can call your president a Christian fundamentalist, but quite clearly a version of biblical text seems to have some form of background in many of the decisions that are being taken. I might be a bit more cynical and say this is a lot more to do with oil than it is to do with the Bible. However, I think that the American public are being given a kind of backcloth, a kind of facade, if you like, of biblical Middle East teaching, which is getting to be a little bit dangerous. When I sit in the Middle East and I listen to it on the radio or I watch it on television, I mean, I'm talking about the news reports out of the United States, I wonder if I'm living on planet Earth or not. One of the critical issues at the moment, which is not really being addressed in the United States, is the enormous support that Christian fundamentalists, the Christian right, are giving to the state of Israel. I mean, we know, for example, in Washington, there are prayer mornings at the Israeli embassy for Christians of this kind, and the degree to which the Christian community who feel this way in the United States are being aligned beside Israel and also the US administration. So that, I mean, what I think is happening in the Middle East is I think George Bush's administration, particularly some of the gentlemen around him, want to redraw the map of the Middle East in a way it hasn't been redrawn since the British and French victors in the First World War broke up and divided the Ottoman Empire among themselves in 1919 and 1920. And this, I think, is why so many Arab leaders are frightened. Of course, they're worried that the Arabs in their countries are going to dethrone them in their anger at America. I think that we're not appreciating the degree to which there must be some pre-planning of this. We didn't just suddenly discover that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. If he has them, we certainly knew that he was interested in them before. We didn't suddenly discover that he's been torturing people or using gas. He was using gas in his war against Iran, against all the laws of war, when Donald Rumsfeld was shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in 1983 on a mission for President Reagan to reopen the American embassy in Baghdad. We didn't care very much about human rights then, nor indeed, it appears, about weapons of mass destruction. So I think that what we need to do is, again, I'm going back to Amira Haas, my colleague in Israel, monitor the centers of power. Why now? What is the background to this? What is the connection between the US administration, the Christian right, and what Israel would like to see in the Middle East? Because clearly, if we actually are redrawing the map of the Middle East, this will be beyond Israel's wildest dreams. So why are we doing this? You talked, by the way, about 250,000 American troops. That may be what it needs to take the 1st Infantry Division over the Tigris River and into Baghdad. The real question is what happens after they arrive there. I'm sure that in the first few days we'll see the New York Times have pictures of Iraqis doing this because, in this part of the world they like winners and they know which side to be on. But shortly afterwards we're going to have other pictures, I suspect, and I fear, of American troops looking up at lampposts from which people will be hanging, because there will be a burst of revenge killings across Iraq if there is an invasion and if Saddam's regime falls. Basra, for example, is going to be a miniature civil war. We haven't heard what America's plans are going to be to smother that civil war, or, on the other hand, whether they intend to just let it burn.
Salt Lake City, Utah.
Sir, you are the scariest kind of ultra-liberal. You're living in Beirut. You're saying how scared you are.
Not about Beirut, sir. Not about Beirut. I'm scared about what's happening in Washington.
Oh, well, no, you're scared about what we're saying to to Al-Qaeda. That scares you. You are...
No, not at all. No, not at all. I'm not at all scared about what you say to Al-Qaeda. I'm scared about what Al-Qaeda says. Al-Qaeda, by the way, is the correct pronunciation. Carry on, yeah?
Al-Qaeda, thank you. You are the ultimate Oliver Stone. There's a conspiracy. There's something read into everything. Bottom line, we are threatened. Are you going to wait for a nuke to drop in London or New York City or Atlanta before you actually perceive a guaranteed threat? I just don't understand your logic. You are totally off, and you actually scare me worse than Al-Qaeda. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's very nice and polite of you to say that. If you're really worried about nuclear weapons, why don't you invade North Korea? We really do think they've probably got nuclear weapons. Now, Saddam may or may not. Maybe the inspectors will find out. But North Korea, it seems to me, since it's in the axis of evil of your president, might be a rather better target. But for some reason, a country which actually does probably have nuclear weapons doesn't seem to worry you so much. It seems that I may worry you, but not North Korea. I should take a much closer look at North Korea and ask yourself why there aren't any plans to invade it. Could it be because it doesn't have oil? Or could it be perhaps that North Korea actually does have a nuclear weapon and has the capability of using it, and we don't really want a nuclear war? I'm not sure about this, but, you know, I think it's time that people who cross-question the motives of government are given a little bit more credence than just to be smeared with a third-rate Hollywood film director's name. I have the same view of Oliver Stone as I think you probably have. I think his work is rubbish. I particularly apply that to the whole Kennedy assassination conspiracy. But I have to live in a part of the world, by the way, where conspiracies do happen. Just remember that the Iranians' democratic government under Mossadegh was overthrown by the CIA and by MI6. Indeed, I've met the MI6 operatives who helped to do that. And the Shah was put back on his throne. These things do exist. I don't trust intelligence services, and I don't think you should. I think we should have the freedom to say, hold on a minute, what's going on here? What does this mean? And it seems to me that for you to go on about liberals and scary people is nonsense. I'm not trying to scare people. I'm frightened, and I'm frightened about the way in which this confrontation is coming about. Years and years ago, I was writing in my newspaper that if we carry on the way we are in the Middle East, we, meaning the British as well as the Europeans as well as America, there is going to be some kind of explosion. And I've watched this coming, and it doesn't please me at all, because I'm the guy who has to go out and be in the front line in wars to report. I'm the person who has much greater danger than you do in Utah. And I'm sorry, but I think that this is a very serious matter. It deserves serious discussion, not waffle about conspiracy theories, but serious investigation as to what the US administration is really doing.
Mr. Fisk writes for The Independent. You can buy it at some newsstands in the United States. You might want to also go to their website, www.independent.co.uk, and you can read some of Mr. Fisk's articles there. Next is San Francisco. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
How do you
Very
do?
good. Early morning in San Francisco. Yes, go on.
It is early in the morning here. But I could resist calling in to get into this conversation because you hit the nail on the head when you talked about our newscasts who don't cast the news. And it's so evident that, you know, all 19 of those men who went into the World Trade Center, we actually educated them to go into the World Trade Center. And, you know, it's just sad the way we've come out of this. Here we're getting ready to go to war. And everybody's talking about war this, war that. You know, and you don't question God or George Bush whatsoever. It's like, you know, you just don't do that. Otherwise, you're losing an election. They actually dogged one of our senators here in Georgia completely. And it's sad. It's just sad how the American people think. Either, you know, they're so ignorant when it comes to voting. There's so many ignorant people that vote, and there are so many ignorant people that don't vote.
Your question for the guest, San Francisco.
So, actually, I don't have one.
Okay.
But I like your insight and clarity, sir, and I thank you for it.
Thanks, San Francisco.
Yeah, I'll just make one comment, if I may. I think one should be very careful when one says things like, oh, you know, America trained them or American educated them. These 19 men committed international crimes against humanity on September the 11th, 2001 in New York, here in New York, and in Washington and in Pennsylvania, of course. I think the issue is not America's responsibility for them, per se. These were very wicked men. Men who left no real message except one infantile message about why they did it. Middle-class people, not the deprived. I've actually visited the home of one of those suicide killers in Lebanon. And the family, I think, was in ignorance of why he did it. At least that's what they told me. I think the issue is, over September the 11th and over the suicide killers, is that we've always refused to ask the question, why? We ask, who did it? We know 19 Arabs calling themselves Muslims, 15 of whom were Saudis. We know how they did it, how they took flight training, how they got on the aircraft, and I'm sure there were lots of dummy runs first to find out estimated time of departure, delays, numbers of passengers, whether the flight deck doors were open. So we know how they did that. But no one was permitted afterwards, and largely this remains the case today, to ask why. If you ask why, it leads you back to the lands they came from, which is the Middle East. And then you ask why, you have to examine what the West does in the Middle East, what America's policies are in the Middle East in relation to the Arab world, Israel, unconditional support for Israel, support for UN sanctions, the vast number of countries in the Middle East where US forces are based. Now, this does cause anger in the Arab world, and we need to have a look at this. But of course, after September the 11th, merely to raise this issue was to bring about accusations that you were pro-terrorist or a conspiracy theorist. Here we go again. And the fact is that when a crime is committed, whether it be in San Francisco or New York or Washington, the first thing the cops do is look for a motive. That's their job, and we accept that. But when we have a crime on the massive scale that took place, the international crime against humanity that took place here in New York and in Washington and Pennsylvania, the one thing we are not encouraged to do is to look for the motive. And that, I think, is something, I go back to Amira House's comment, that's something we should be doing.
And that brings us to your book, Pity the Nation. What is it?
Well, you know, when I wrote it, it was a story about how journalists try to deal with the truth in a very horrific, bloody civil war, the Lebanese civil war, in which 150,000 people died, most of them civilians. It was, in a way, an adventure story, but a very tragic one, in which I had the misfortune to be present and watch, right from the beginning, right to the very day when the last shots were fired. And indeed, in a way, that war continues with the war in southern Lebanon that goes on to this day. So when I wrote it, it was a story about why these terrible events happened, which I saw. A reviewer in Chicago, I think it was the Chicago Tribune, spotted something which I missed when I was writing it, that it's also in a way about a book about genocide. It refers constantly to the Armenian genocide of 1915. The book actually begins in Auschwitz, a Birkenau camp. It begins with the Jewish Holocaust in the Second World War. It goes through a whole series of little genocides in Lebanon between various groups, Christian Maronites, Druze, Palestinians, and so on. And particularly it deals with the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, where even before the murderers left, having killed 1,700 Palestinian civilians, I got into the camp and saw some of the most terrible scenes of carnage I've ever witnessed in my life. In retrospect now, having done the new edition and added quite a lot of pages to it, a couple of chapters, I think the book is something even more different than it was when I began. I think now it's a book about the malign influence of history upon us. My father, and I realise more and more as the years go by what an influence he had over me, my father was much older than my mother, and he was a soldier in the First World War. He took part in the Third Battle of Arras on the Somme in 1918. In fact, he took a camera to the trenches. I have his actual photographs from the First World War. And as a little boy, aged 5 and onwards, he used to take me every year back to the battlefields of France. So I grew up from a very young age realizing that Europe had gone through 2 appalling wars, the scale of which makes the so-called War on Terror look like nothing at all. And I was very struck as the years went by when I learned that the victors of my father's Great War, in just 17 months, between 1919 and 1920, drew the boundaries of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and the Middle East. And I've spent almost all my professional life watching those boundaries burn and watching the people within those frontiers burn. And so I think in a way now I actually refer to my father briefly, and in my next book, which I'm writing next year, I will much more so, and I'll talk about the First World War. I'm very struck by the way in which we cannot escape the malign influence of history. No Jew living in Israel can escape the horrors of the Jewish Holocaust in the Nazi era. No Armenians living in Lebanon can escape the horrors of the genocide by the Turkish Ottoman forces in 1915. The Palestinians, not in the same scale, but the Palestinians cannot escape the results of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The Lebanese themselves are living in a country artificially created by the French Empire, if you like, as part of the League of Nations mandate after the First World War, in which the Maronite Christians, who are now a minority, were given the best jobs in the state. Over and over again, we find it impossible to break free of the borders and frontiers, both the mental kind and the physical kind, which our fathers and grandfathers set down for us. And I think one of the things we don't concentrate enough upon is the degree to which so-called peace processes, whether they be in Northern Ireland or whether they be in Bosnia or particularly the Middle East, the degree to which they try to set right the injustices of our grandparents, rather than just find a quick fix to make a US president look good or a Palestinian leader look good or an Israeli prime minister look good. And so I think the book, when I look at it now, and I was having another look at it last night, I don't even remember writing some of the passages which appall me with their horror and bloodthirstiness now and the things I saw. I think it's become a book about the way in which history grasps us and strangles us and makes us do things which, if we were rational and could break free from it, we would never do.
Nazareth, Pennsylvania.
I really have got to agree with the president for, I don't know what you expect them to do. I mean, we didn't ask for this war. We didn't ask for a war in World War II. We tried to stay by ourselves and not get involved until we were attacked. We were attacked again, and if President Bush didn't do something, then everybody would be saying, well, why didn't he do more? The thing is, my father fought in World War II, and he was in the Middle East, and he said that there will never be peace in the Middle East. The thing is, talk to some of these survivors from the World Trade Center, or go look at the site where the towers once stood and say, how can we sit back and do nothing?
I don't think anyone expects Americans to sit back and do nothing. I think your dad may have had a very good point, by the way, in World War II from his experience in the Middle East. I can tell you, I think I'd probably agree with him. Look, I think we have to realize something that, again, we've got to ask the why question. These vile, wicked men did not just fly out of the sky from nowhere. They didn't get up in the morning and say, oh, we hate democracy. Most of them wouldn't know what democracy was. We need to say, hold on a second, if this is an attack upon us, it was an attack, it's an attack on all of us, of course it was. What did we do that may have lit a match somewhere in the past? I'm not saying we blame ourselves, they did the World Trade Center, we didn't. But I do think we have to look that, for example, if you live in the Middle East, it's possible through the eyes of the people there, I don't necessarily share this view, but it's possible to see the historical results of our doings, our policies in the Middle East, as a form of warfare against that part of the world. When, for example, I'm driving on a road in Lebanon, as I was in 1996, and an ambulance carrying children and women behind me is hit by a missile fired by an American-made Israeli Apache helicopter, and I take the bits of that missile, which I did, from the scene, including with the help of UN, from some of the corpses, and find that the entire missile was made in Duluth, Georgia, an AGM-114C, the Hellfire missile it's called. It's understandable, surely, that there are people on the ground in Lebanon, the families, for example, of those children and those women, would say, well, hold on a second, this is an American missile, we're being attacked by the West. Now, actually, the family, the husband of one of the women did not say that to his great credit. I've spoken to all the families involved in this tragic incident. The Israelis, by the way, say there was a Hezbollah man in the ambulance, which is not correct. I've investigated it, but that's what they said. Even then, of course, it's still breaking the rules of war. However, the point is, over and over again, American weaponry is killing people who are innocent. Now, we can say collateral damage, but at the end of the day, you can see, perhaps, if you live in that area, how those people say, we're under attack from America. Again, this is not in any way an excuse. It is not in any way, absolving the killers of September the 11th, 2001 from the international crimes against humanity which they committed. But we need to stay back a little bit and say, hang on a minute here, how did this come about and how can we prevent this sort of thing happening again? If bombing Afghanistan and killing lots and lots of innocent Afghans, which we've done along with the Taliban and a few Al-Qaeda people, if that really is the only way we can respond, well, we are in eternal war. I was interested in your comment about World War II. America did nothing till it was attacked. You're dead right. America endured a very profitable period of neutrality for more than 2 years before it came to help us in Britain, who were standing alone at that point against Nazi Germany. And remember, in the Second World War, Britain actually went to war because Germany invaded Poland, not because Britain was initially attacked.
Blue Ridge, Georgia.
Oh, hello. This has been most fascinating. Mr. Fisk, you have the most intelligent and educated and
No, it's just early in the morning, that's all. I go on high caliber at this time of the morning.
Oh, well, I disagree with Bush, and I feel like he has been looking at this whole mess in such a simplistic uneducated view that he's only taken one side of everything. And I think that that he had decided to create a war and then told his intelligence people and everyone to find justification. Now, what I think he doesn't really comprehend, this is not a chess game, him against Saddam Hussein. I think he's totally forgetting that Saddam Hussein is going to escape the same way bin Laden did, and that we will be killing the people, the civilians, the innocent people in Iraq that have already been terrorized by their government.
Mr. Fisk.
Well, look, I think, I was about to say, what a voice of sensitivity and judgment, it entirely coincides with my own. But I think perhaps you're being a little bit unfair to Mr. Bush. I find it difficult to say that sometimes. But, look, I think the issues are that, yes, I think we're looking for an excuse. We, the West, are looking for an excuse to go to war, or at least Mr. Bush and our own dear Prime Minister, Tony Blair. I think there are serious issues. There are great injustices in the Middle East. And Saddam is one. He is a monster. Hangmen are on 24-hour duty. Women are hanged on Tuesdays and Thursdays in Baghdad. And we shouldn't forget it's a loathsome regime. The real issue, is that why we're going to war? Or is it really about the fact that this loathsome regime happens to sit on an awful lot of what the French call black gold, in other words, oil? I think the other thing you see is that we may not actually, with our bombs, kill lots of civilians. I fear we might, but we may well not. But lots of civilians will die as a result of the revenge killings which our war will bring about. We may wash our hands of that. But at the end of the day, I think we do have to take responsibility for that. An awful lot of people die in the Middle East because of our actions. And that is a fact, unfortunately. The only other comment I'd make is to say that I'm always struck, and here I am going back to the First World War again, I'm always struck by something that Lawrence of Arabia said. Lawrence, who of course gave a totally false promise to the Arabs of complete independence if they joined our side against Germany and the Turks in the First World War. He said that it's very easy to make war, but it's a very messy business, and once it begins, it's like trying to drink soup off a knife.
Another call from Georgia, this one Dalton, Georgia.
Good morning, Mr. Fisk.
Good morning.
I've listened earlier when you were talking about our past relationship with Saddam Hussein and insinuated that we were part to blame for what was going on. And
well, I think America did support Saddam in the war against Iran. There's no doubt about that.
Sure. I have no problem with it.
Sure.
I understand that. But what you try to do, and other people like you who use this example, is you don't understand that, or apparently you don't understand that things change, people change. One analogy is when Timothy McVeigh was in our military service. He was in our armed forces. We put our arms around him as an ally. But when he did what he did, we executed him. We turned on him just like we're turned on Saddam Hussein. So things change, and just because what happened in the past is we had relationships with Saddam Hussein or other leaders who turned against us.
Thanks, caller.
We have a right to do that.
Yeah, well, hold on a second. Timothy McVeigh, as I understand it, and from you too, changed. Saddam Hussein did not change. We knew when we supported him, when we helped to build up his military forces, we knew he was a mass murderer. We knew he used gas. He didn't change. He's the same guy now he was before. I've actually met the German arms dealer who took the satellite photo reconnaissance pictures of the Iranian front line from the Pentagon to Baghdad. America was supporting Saddam in the war against Iran. So was Britain. I actually travelled back from the battlefront in Ahwaz on an Iranian troop train filled with Iranian soldiers who were coughing up gas from their lungs into handkerchiefs in the train. I actually went round some of the carriages, opening the windows, because the carriage was full of gas, Iraqi gas, given them by Germany, by the way, which was coming out of their lungs and filling the carriage. And when I got back to London and reported on the front page of my newspaper, which was then the London Times, the Foreign Office told my then editor that the story was, quote, not helpful. You see, the British, like the Americans, they knew what Saddam was doing. They were well aware of the vicious human rights abuses. They knew that women were being raped in front of their husbands if their husbands were involved in the opposition. They knew of his massive human rights abuses. They knew he was possibly developing weapons of mass destruction. He did not change. We didn't care about Saddam then. We didn't worry about him then. We thought he was one of our guys. Now suddenly you're telling me, oh, well, people change. They don't. It is the same Saddam. And that is why it's very important to ask, not just why Donald Rumsfeld went to Baghdad to shake hands with Saddam Hussein and reopen the American embassy in 1983, but why the following year he was meeting with Tariq Aziz, the number 2 in the Ba'ath Party Iraqi leadership, on the very day that the UN published its first report on the use of gas, a war crime against the Iranians.
Atlanta.
Hi, I just wanted to congratulate you. I believe you're the most honest reporter.
Stop. Even from Atlanta, this is wrong.
No. Seriously, I am going to distribute your information all over the campuses. I'm going to tell your website because you are telling the truth. Saddam Hussein has not changed. We helped him out. And besides that, bin Laden was helped to train by the CIA. Some people are not aware of this. And I don't know how the news here don't distribute this information. We are kept in the shadow. We are saying that this is a war against some evil terrorists. I mean, we don't look at the reasons why, like you are saying now. And I would just like you to keep explaining why and keep telling us your point of view, because we obviously can't get that point of view over here.
Well, I think you'll find that many European newspapers, I mean, don't just single me out for trying to ask the question why. A lot of us in Europe are asking the question why. My newspaper, The Independent, is totally against, I mean, editorially against any future war in Iraq, for all kinds of reasons, not just quite different in some cases from the reasons I'm putting towards you. But I think in Europe we've been asking the why question for a long time. The Guardian, I mean, I hate to support my rivals' newspapers in Britain. You should look not just to the Independent website, but go to the Guardian website in London, the other great British newspaper, which does ask questions. If you speak French, go to the websites of Le Monde, Libération, El País in Spain, for example. I think it's very important to try and go to other sources of information. I think you put it very well. I will, my next lecture on the subject, I'll use your phrase, the shadow under which you live. I think in Europe, though we have many things to answer for, and our weakness over Bosnia is one of them, by the way, I think we don't live so much under that shadow, possibly because we've gone through a lot more real wars than America has. At the same time, yes, it's a great pity, isn't it, that you can't read this questioning in the American press, or certainly not in mainstream America. I hate that word, mainstream, on ordinary American TV networks.
Marlton, New Jersey.
Yes, I have a question concerning your opinion about the reason for the war. You say it's the oil.
The war hasn't actually begun yet, by the way.
Well, okay, but it's...
It's coming, huh?
Yeah, it's coming. And
Well,
you say it's mostly about oil, yet they tell us Iraq only supplies about 3.5% or something like that of the oil. And if the Russians could produce more, the Saudis could produce more, why would we do this just for the small amount of oil?
Because Iraq has the largest untapped reserves of oil in the world. And if the United States, and by that I mean, of course, the new friendly, democratic, pro-American government that will be set up by General Tommy Franks in Baghdad, according to the New York Times, it's going to be like, Japan post-World War II, this government will give oil concessions predominantly, of course, to US oil companies. And if America controls the Iraqi oil fields, they will be able to control the price of Saudi oil. And thus the whole system of OPEC will, in effect, either collapse or come under American control. It's interesting that Lukoil, the major Russian oil consortium, has been having talks in Washington. And though we don't know the contents of these talks, I'm sure what's happening is that the Russians are being told, stay on side over the UN resolution, and we'll make sure that Lukoil's current contracts, which are with the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein, will, in part at least, be honoured after an American invasion. And I rather suspect that ELF and the various French oil companies have probably been told the same thing, which might have brought President Chirac of France on side. This is speculation, but we do know that Lukoil has been in Washington talking to the Americans. The prize, look, let me put it this way. If all Iraq produced was tulips, I don't think we would be invading Iraq.
What are your travels now? You live in Beirut. You've been here in Washington for how long?
New York.
New York.
Yeah, I actually travel to the States virtually every 3.5 to 4 weeks to give lectures and talks about the Middle East, because a growing number of universities and academic institutions here ask me to do that. I don't do it for money either. I do it because I think it's the duty of a journalist to try and explain to people what's happening. Admittedly, it's my imperfect personal view of it, but I give it. This is the longest trip I've made recently to the States. I've been in North Carolina, Washington University in the St. Louis, also Webster University there. I've been up in Canada at the University of Toronto, Montreal yesterday. I'm going on from New York to Indiana, to Purdue University in Indianapolis, and then I'm continuing on to give some talks in San Francisco. Then I'm going to Ireland to give the Bloody Sunday lecture, which is all about Irish history, which is my great interest in life. And then I'm returning to Beirut the following day, which will be Wednesday of next week. I'll be back in southern Lebanon doing a story on the waters of the Wazani River on the border with Israel.
Another call from Atlanta. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm calling from Atlanta. I just recently spent about 4.5 years in the Middle East and going over the media that I went through in the Middle East, and as well as the English media that I was reading through, the Financial Times and the London Times that was available. And the differences that I found in what is portrayed by the media in the Middle East as opposed to what is portrayed by the media in the United States is so drastically different that even, for example, CNN, you would find CNN coming out with one report from one point of view and Al Jazeera coming with another report from a completely different point of view. Then you have the intermediary source, BBC, which is giving their point of view, which is actually closer to what Al Jazeera is giving as opposed to being closer to what CNN is. As a person who spent the time there, I found it very, very disturbing when I came back to the United States in Atlanta to see that the media is actually a highly manipulative source of perceptions. And sadly, that has caused a lot of realities being formed in our minds, playing on our fear, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How would you say that media would be able to come to a point where they'll actually put that as a fair point of view, a realistic, objective point of view, without actually being completely involved in developing perceptions?
Well, I think there are about 2 or 3 different points there, and I don't know if we have the time to go into all of them. Number one, I think it's important to point out, you didn't, but I think you've got a bit near to it, that the arid wastes of Arab journalism should not be forgotten. The Arab press is really abysmal. Most of the time, with the sole exception of Al Jazeera, and that's a whole other issue. I'm not that great a fan of Al Jazeera. The Arab press are mouthpieces for dictators. They are truly... The Arab journalists, in most cases, with 1 or 2 Lebanese exceptions, are truly pathetic. So let's just remember that. When it comes to a question of perceptions, you know, in European journalism, we believe that not only do we say what's going on, but we get out there in the field and say, look, that's what I've just seen and that's what I suspect is going on. I think this guy means this. And it goes under our byline. This is the report. This is the newspaper, etc. American journalism seems to keep much more to the school of journalism, if you like, where everybody gets equal numbers of paragraphs. I don't think this is objectivity at all. I think this is mathematics. I think we should be fair to everyone. I try, you know, whenever, for example, even in the case of Kosovo, I reported as passionately as I could, or compassionately as I could, on the innocent Serb victims of that war, as well as the Muslims who were being driven so cruelly from their homes and murdered by the Serbs. But I think the point is that, you know, supposing we were trying to report the slave trade, would we give equal time and equal fairness to the slave ship captain as we would to the slaves? If we're present at the liberation of an extermination camp, do we give equal time to the SS as we do to the prisoners? You know, there is an issue of justice and injustice in the Middle East. And I think that the European press, with many mistakes and imperfections, and sometimes I find some of my colleagues drive me up the wall with their personalised reporting, and I'm sure I occasionally do the same, I think we try and get near to the reality, try it in a greater way than perhaps the American press and television does. I'm sure we do. At the same time, I think the problem for the American press is not whether or not it's an attempt to change perceptions. It's that the American media, by and large, speaks with the voice of government. And I suspect there is in this country, whether it's a ghost of McCarthyism or not, I don't know, a suspicion that a journalist who challenges the foreign policy of his country when it's at war, or when he thinks it's at war, is in some way subversive. And that's not the case. In a war and a crisis, a journalist has a duty to challenge what the government says more than ever, and that's his duty to you, the public. It's not a question of framing perceptions. He can actually get access to people whom ordinary folk can't. And I think he needs to do it with challenge, with monitoring the centres of power. I go back to Amira House again, not just being spoon-spared the latest statement. You know, we're going over to the State Department now. John, what is State Department saying? Oh, well, the State Department says, just watch it on CNN or indeed CBS or ABC. It's always the same functionary we see rather than journalist.
Robert Fisk is the author of this book, Pity the Nation, The Abduction of Lebanon. You also are a contributor to a book that we have here called Iraq Under Siege, which I think is...
Actually, let me correct that. One of my long articles in The Independent appears in that book. I didn't actually contribute it. I told them they could use it. I have, of course, read the book. But it's a book which has a number of conflicting views on Iraq under the UN sanctions. And, of course, I've been to Iraq a lot of times and actually reported on particularly the use, or the results of the use of depleted uranium munitions used by the Allies, that famous phrase, in the 1991 war, and the outburst of cancers, particularly among children in southern Iraq. So that does form part of my contribution to that book, but it was made up mainly of my own articles. I didn't individually contribute, though that doesn't mean I don't mean what I say in the book.
Robert Fisk, thank you very much for joining us from New York this morning.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, in about 30 minutes, General George Jalwin will be with us. We're going to be talking about the President's trip to NATO, what that meeting means, and what it means in terms of the future of NATO. That's coming up in about 30 minutes. And in just about 5 minutes, we're going to turn to another question this morning. It's from the front pages of the New York Times, and it's talking about the accounting of the United Way.